Welcome to another of our insurance videos. I'm delighted to welcome today Arthur Wightman, the Territory Leader of PwC in Bermuda. Arthur, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Arthur, we've had a series of video interviews with some wonderful leaders from the industry, including John Neal, Moses Ajay Hoba, Albert Benchamal and Karen White. What are your key takeaways from what they've been saying to us?
Well, I think naturally the video series is being contextualized by the initial and obviously continuing impacts of COVID-19. It's an understatement to say that the pandemic has wrought enormous damage, personal, economic, social, around the world. And whilst it might be considered to be primarily a healthcare problem, it has had immense immediate implications for business and economic, fiscal and monetary policy around the world. And while we think the health crisis is likely to be overcome in the short to medium term, the wider issues have, I think, exacerbated five big problems that really existed before the crisis. Problems like the increasing wealth disparity and the erosion of the middle class, the pervasive nature of technology and its impact on individuals, society, the climate, age demographic pressures, particularly on businesses, social institutions and economies. A real breakdown, I think, in global consensus with growing nationalism and populism that we're seeing around the world. And to an extent, the declining confidence in some of the institutions that underpin society. So these are big problems that existed before, and they've, I think, been amplified as a result of the pandemic. And these problems have impacted the industry to varying degrees. Certainly, as I've spent time with CEOs over the last several months and listening to the views of the CEOs that you've interviewed as part of the series, I think there's some common threads. Firstly, and obviously, there's been a need to repair balance sheets in response not just to COVID-19 claims, but of course, a heightened level of natural disaster activity. And of course, while CEOs are seeking to repair balance sheets, they're also needing to think about the future, both at a practical and conceptual level, somewhat differently, as I say, from how they might have been thinking, back in January. The industry's role is so societally important, and with the playing field shifting, so enormously, you just have to look at the impact of the pandemic on business interruption. CEOs really are needing to be prepared to steer their companies very differently into the future. And so, whilst they've been seeking to repair their organizations and rethink about their future, that there's a real degree of reconfiguration to the organizations as well. We've seen obviously mass transfer of activity to a virtual environment, but there are some other transformative changes that need to take place in the medium to the long term. And then I think something that I did feel came out of the interviews that you've had with the CEOs, there really is a need to report information transparently, whether it's to customers or investors or wider stakeholders, I think, overall. And this will be really key, I think, in terms of building trust back into society that in varying degrees perhaps has been lost over the last number of months.
And thinking, obviously, you're based in Bermuda, thinking about the Bermuda insurance market, what's been the impact on Bermuda and the way the insurance industry operates there?
Well, Oliver, obviously, what a difference a year makes. I had the pleasure of spending time with you in November last year, and as a consequence of your visit, you simulated your thoughts and wrote about the Bermuda market overall, covering a number of things, but also perhaps focusing on some of the threats to the jurisdiction, whether it's tax advantages, consolidation in the industry, or some of the competition from other jurisdictions. Roll forward 12 months, but Bermuda is at the forefront of global capital raising in the reinsurance sectors, with estimates of approximately $12 to $15 billion of new capital being deployed into the sector. And only very recently, since the beginning of the year, we've had 35 new insurance incorporations. And the class of 2020 definitely is well on the way to establishing itself. Not something, I have to say, that people thought we'd really see again since 2005 and 2006, and particularly, of course, also since insurance-linked securities have had an impact, most notably in de-peaking some of the pricing cycles since then. real hubbub of activity. You know, and from
You
my
talk about
perspective,
the class of 2020. What
yeah.
sort of a class will this be? What will be the focus of the companies who are setting up in Bermuda at the moment?
Yeah, great question. I mean, clearly, natural catastrophes and protection thereon are going to be an important core of those activities. But I think, of course, the opportunities for growth, whether it's the established players or the new class, are in looking to cover more broadly pandemic risk. And then also, of course, looking at cyber, where the industry really is only offering a fraction, I think, of the coverage that it probably needs to cover a systemic event, not something that we've seen. So I think those are some of the areas. Clearly, there are other market environments, whether it's E&S in the US or other that are attractive. But certainly there seems to be a focus of the new class on some of the core products and services that the Bermuda market is known for. Just before we move on, Oliver, one final thing I thought I'd just throw into the mix that provides kind of an attractive lens on the jurisdiction is something we've talked to before, which is around its response to the pandemic. Incident rates in the country are very low. Our testing regime is very strong. Other jurisdictions, whether it's the US or UK, really are rating the island as very low risk, and that's providing, I think, an impetus for people to participate in that and engage in the Bermuda market. It's certainly a place where people can come and actually safely have business meetings. So sorry to interrupt.
That's all right. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned natural catastrophe risk, and clearly, while coronavirus has been the big theme of the year, it's not been the only thing that's happened. We've had a very active hurricane season. We've also had very devastating wildfires across the world. And I wanted to ask you how the insurance industry is responding to climate change and these consequences of climate change.
Yeah, another great question. Reinsurance, clearly plays a critical role in addressing the impact of climate change, building climate resilience. The evidence is abundant, which highlights, the increasing severity, frequency of weather-related events, and as you mentioned, importantly, the harm caused by some of the secondary climate-related perils, whether that be droughts, floods, wildfires, you name it. The Geneva Association, which of course you know well, is heavily focused on the role that the industry must play, and indeed already plays in planning for climate change and mitigating the impact of natural disasters. I think as risk managers or underwriters, the industry clearly has been driving the use of risk analytics. It has already been helping to create some of the solutions in terms of pushing on the use of preventative measures. And something which is clearly at the heart of the Bermuda story, it's fostering a lot more innovation, I think, around the provision of risk transfer solutions, whether that's parametric covers or some of the ILS solutions that are being presented. And so these are elements which support, I think, a wider agenda of sustainability and resilience, and are clearly necessary as we go forward. The other interesting facet, which we've seen a lot more of late, is how reinsurers are thinking about the asset side of their balance sheet, and I think again importantly considering much more some of the ESG strategies that we're seeing blossoming around the world, particularly as a result of some of the work that was done pre and during the COVID pandemic, and that's a trend I think we're clearly going to see going forward. The Geneva Association, other stakeholders in the industry are really focused on climate resilience, decarbonized, financial infrastructure, and this is a major opportunity for the industry to grasp and grapple with. But it's going to need the support of governments around the world, other stakeholders to try and drive this agenda further.
One last question for you, Arthur.
Yeah.
I think if I'd asked you last year what we would be discussing now, climate change will probably have come up on the list, pandemics, possibly not. If I can ask you that question now, what do you think we will be discussing in a year's time? What do you think the big topics will be next autumn?
Yeah, I think naturally, when you look at the impact the pandemic has had on businesses, and the interruption it's created to the businesses, it comes back to the same thematic point that we've been discussing for years now, which is the protection gap. There was a significant protection gap associated with business interruption as a result of this pandemic. And that's an area that I think we're going to be talking about. Closer to home, Oliver, naturally, I think we're going to be talking about how effective the deployment of the $12 to $15 billion of capital into Bermuda has actually been. And I'm hoping, of course, in 12 months' time that we're going to see a lot of innovation, a lot of focus on that protection gap and the deployment of that capital in some really new and interesting ways.
Great. Well, we shall see, but that's all we have time for today. Arthur Wightman, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you for having me.